Good afternoon, everyone. People are coming in. I can see many attendees already. More than 20 and going up, Maurício.
Great.
Let's give a few seconds so that we can have more people in. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm Katia Vale, Schools and Exams Marketing Manager based in São Paulo, working in the Cambridge team. And on behalf of our team, I would like to welcome you all to the first webinar of a series of webinars we will be having this semester. Today, we have the pleasure of having with us Mauricio Shiroma, who is going to talk to us about the bias in critical thinking. I believe we can start sharing the slides, Mauricio, with our participants. And I would like to know where you are joining from. Can you use the chat box and tell us where you are joining from so that we have an idea? I can't see answers coming in yet.
Katia, I'm afraid the chat is disabled.
Really?
Let me check. You can use the answer, the Q&A here to inform.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leo. No problems. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining. And I can see so many people writing here the places. Great. So a little bit of housekeeping before we start. If we can go to the next slide, Mauricio. We will be sending you certificates. I know how important they are to you. So please watch out. By the end of the presentation, we will post a link for a feedback form. And after you fill in the feedback, you will be able to download your certificate. Throughout the presentation, if you have questions, please use the Q&A tool to send us your questions, and we will be dealing with them by the end of this presentation. So without further ado, let me just introduce you to Mauricio Shiroma, who has taught English, trained EFL teachers, and worked for several ELT publishers before becoming a freelancer 10 years ago. He has worked as an author, contributor, and editor on a wide variety of publications from preschool to upper secondary education, including preparatory courses intended for students who will take the ENEM. Here with us at Cambridge, he is the co-author of a series for teenagers called Global Changer. And as I told you, this is the first webinar in a series. So we will have Veronica Teodorov next, talking on Learn to Learn. Then Viviane Kirmeliene with the topic of creative thinking, followed by Paulo Machado with visual literacy, and to close up, Denise Santos with cross-curricular content. So please watch out for new links to enroll for our next webinars that we will be sending soon. So Mauricio, it's over to you now. Have an excellent presentation.
Thanks, Katia. And thank you all for joining us today. Well, I'd like to begin by saying that I am not an expert in critical thinking, okay? In fact, the more I study it, the more questions I have. So what I want to achieve today is to provide insights, food for thought, hoping that it helps us get closer to what we believe is the right or the best way to understand and teach critical thinking. Like I just said, I'll be answering some of your questions at the end of the presentation, if I can. So please leave your questions or share your thoughts on the chat box or the Q&A. Okay. All right, so before we talk about bias in critical thinking, maybe we should talk about what critical thinking is, because it may not be what we think it is. Okay, now critical thinking is not a new concept. It has been discussed by ancient philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and continues to be discussed in the 21st century. Critical thinking has been included in school curriculums around the world, including Brazil, where critical thinking is listed as one of the general competencies at the Brazilian National Common Core Curriculum, which we call BNCC. It is bundled with scientific and creative thinking. But what exactly is critical thinking? Well, we all agree that critical thinking is important, but there is a lack of consensus about what critical thinking is. There's lack of consensus on how to teach critical thinking. And some people don't even believe it's possible to teach critical thinking. Okay? So there are basically two ways of viewing critical thinking. Some researchers believe that critical thinking skills can be generalized and applied to different contexts and subjects, and can be taught in a generic way. For example, a skill like understanding the links between ideas. This can be applied to any area of knowledge. On the other hand, other researchers believe that critical thinking skills can only be taught in the context of a specific subject. For example, let's say that we ask students to read two different articles. One is an opinion article, and the other is a scientific article. For the opinion text, critical thinking teaches us to analyze the arguments, evaluate the evidence, identify facts and opinions, consider different points of view and perspectives, and reach a conclusion based on our own reasoning. But this type of process isn't relevant in science, where the most important thing is to check if the scientific method was followed. That is, were the facts established after making an observation, forming a hypothesis, making a prediction, conducting an experiment and analyzing the results? So as you see, different contexts and areas of knowledge, different ways to apply critical thinking. And there are those who believe some skills are general while others are specific. So before we can think of how education can help students to develop critical thinking skills, we need to define what we believe critical thinking is and how to best teach it. Now, the general principles of critical thinking are related to the ability of receiving, collecting, and analyzing information effectively. That is, identifying links between ideas, analyzing and evaluating arguments, identifying patterns and relationships, separating what's necessary from what's irrelevant in a discussion. What else? Identifying gaps in reasoning, and using these skills to form an argument, solve a problem, or reach a conclusion. In schools, critical thinking is mostly treated as a general skill that can be taught in a generic way. And I believe this is because there isn't enough time to teach critical thinking and all the facts, theories, principles, ideas, specific vocabulary, for example, that is specific for every school subject. But there is evidence that it's very, very difficult for students to transfer critical thinking skills that they apply in one context to another context. And this supports the idea that there are different critical thinking skills for different areas of knowledge. There's a scientist called Daniel Willingham. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. And he published a paper in 2019 called How to Teach Critical Thinking, which he wrote for the Department of Education in Australia. And he believes that the general skill approach is a mistake. He believes that critical thinking is domain specific. It is a specific skill related to a specific area of knowledge. He says that different areas of knowledge, such as science and history, for example, have different definitions of what it means to know something. And they apply analysis, synthesis, and evaluation in different ways. You can find this paper at danielwillingham.com in the article sections. He also wrote an article called Critical Thinking, Why is it so hard to teach? Which provides really useful insights, so please do check those. So does that mean that we can't teach critical thinking as a general skill? Well, according to cognitive scientist Tim van Gelder, that's not necessarily true. Now, he wrote an article called Teaching Critical Thinking, Some Lessons from Cognitive Science, in which he talked about 6 lessons that summarized all the insights he had while studying critical thinking. Now, I won't be talking in detail about the first 5 lessons, but in general terms, he says that becoming an expert in critical thinking is hard. That we have to practice critical thinking skills in order to improve these skills. That we must practice the transference of skills between contexts. He also said that we need to have at least some theoretical knowledge about something to be able to think critically about it. Okay? Van Gelder also said that students improve their critical thinking skills faster when they learn how to present their arguments in maps by creating a visually simple way to see the connections of ideas, reasons, assumptions, objections, which would help them understand how arguments are constructed. So this is a brief summary of the first 5 lessons based on Van Gelder's insights that can be used as guidelines for teaching critical skills. Well, as you can see, critical thinking is not an easy task. And teaching critical thinking is not easy. All right, so at this point, you might be thinking, okay, Mauricio, what is your view on critical thinking? What do you believe is true about critical thinking? How do you teach critical thinking? So here's what I think. I believe thinking critically is not natural. We can't assume people know how to get information, understand it, question it, and use it effectively. It's something that we can learn with life experience and with examples from the world around us. And we need to have discipline to incorporate it in our lives. I believe that we need to have knowledge about something before we can think critically about it. For example, if I asked you your opinion on lab milk, that is, milk created in laboratories with synthetic milk protein that is identical to cow's milk, but made with 0 involvement from any cows, what would you say? Well, first, you have to know what lab milk is. how it is created, what is the impact on the environment, if there's any, how safe it is for consumption, how much it costs. You would need to check the sources that are making these claims. You would need to read studies. And then you can express an opinion, right? But that leads to another problem. When we encourage students to go out there in the world and get all the information they can about something in order to have enough knowledge to be able to think critically about it, this may be dangerous, as we may be encouraging them to engage with misinformation and giving a lot of attention to it. So we'll see why this is problematic in a few minutes. As for teaching critical skills, or as for teaching critical thinking, I believe it's important to teach students about common sense, open-mindedness, skepticism, reasoning, logic, generalization, correlation, causality, anything that can help them to develop critical thinking skills. So let's name these things and let's introduce them to students. I also believe that we should help students reflect on how their opinions are formed, how they connect and combine assumptions, objections, facts to form their opinions. And finally, I believe that we can't really think critically unless we are aware of our biases, which can alter our perception of reality, our judgment, and our capacity to make impartial observations. And that's the reason why I left lesson 6 and Tim Van Gelder's article for last, because it is related to the point of this webinar, bias. Okay, so lesson 6, belief preservation. Tim Van Gelder believes that we all have tendencies that corrupt our thinking and contaminate our beliefs, his words. So we must be aware of them and compensate for their influence. It is difficult for us to think critically about something that conflicts with our belief structure. We tend to favor ideas that confirm our beliefs and ignore ideas that conflict with what we want to believe. And these tendencies are called biases. Okay. And it is important to make a distinction at this point. A common mistake people tend to make is to confuse the terms bias, stereotype, and prejudice. So let me give you an example to differentiate them. Okay. Suppose you have a friend who tells you that his Asian neighbor is antisocial. And then one day you have an unpleasant interaction with another Asian person. So you create a stereotype in your mind. Asian people are antisocial. Then one day a Japanese person moves next door to you. You immediately wait for the worst. You think this person will not look you in the eye, that this person will never talk to you, that you'll never be friends. You have a bias against this person. Then, instead of giving this person a chance to prove you wrong, you convince your neighbors not to invite this person to their meetings and social gatherings. That's prejudice. It's a simple example, but it is important to make this distinction before we start talking about biases. Okay? So, bias is a tendency, an inclination that impacts our judgment of a particular person, opinion, or thing, and influences our support or opposition to it. Biases affect our lives and the lives of people who interact with us. It affects our perception, or attitudes, or behavior, attention, our ability to listen, and so on. Now, imagine that there's an activity in the course book, and there's a picture of a modern school in Japan, with Japanese students quietly doing an exercise on their books, and you ask your students if they would like to study in Japan. If your students have a bias against Japanese people, they may not be open to this experience, as they may believe that they will not have friends at school, that they will be treated badly by their classmates, etc. And their answers will be based on this bias, even if they are not aware of it. Their critical thinking is compromised. And there are other types of biases that impact our ability to think critically, especially because most of the time we are not aware of these biases. So the natural question is, how do I identify these biases, and what should I do to overcome them? Well, first we have to acknowledge that having biases doesn't mean we're bad people. We all have biases, and they come from our upbringing, from our culture and society, from our education, our life experience. Second, we can't know what we don't know until we know. Does that make sense? Well, right now you don't know the types of biases. So first you have to learn about each type of bias, then you will know if you have that bias. You may be asking, well, how many biases are there to learn? Well, you will find answers ranging from 3 to 188. Okay. Apparently, there are 197 biases listed in Wikipedia, but I couldn't confirm that. And no, I won't be explaining all these types of biases. I'll leave that task to you. Okay? But just imagine explaining all of them to our students before we can even begin to talk about critical thinking. And yet, this might be the insight they need in order to develop critical thinking. Because biases can make us avoid information that does not align with our beliefs. Biases can make us see connections between ideas that do not exist. Biases can make us perpetuate misconceptions and misinformation, and so on. We can't really think critically unless we are aware of our biases. In class, biases present themselves in the way we pair students, in our choices of songs and books that we recommend, in the way we treat and communicate with students, in our expectations from certain students, in discussions of controversial topics, in the feedback we give to our students, etc. But because there are so many biases, we have to make choices and choose some of them and find moments in our classes when we can teach them. We have to find opportunities in our lesson plans, in group discussions, and homework assignments to present these biases and make students aware of them. So I'm going to talk about some biases and give suggestions on how to incorporate them into your practice using examples from the pages of our book series, Global Changer. And if you're asking yourself, which biases should I choose to teach? Well, that's a question only you can answer, because it varies. Maybe the biases you find in an urban private school for the rich are different from the biases you find in a public school in a small town. Maybe. Let's not assume that. Well, you can look for the most common types of biases, or work with the biases you have noticed in your classes. I don't know. You're the best person to make that decision. So I'll just show some examples of work with biases, and I hope you can transfer those to your reality. Okay. So the first one I'm going to tell you about is probably the most famous, confirmation bias, which is the tendency to only look for information or only believe in information that supports our opinion, our point of view. So I found this poster on page 66 of our starter book. This activity I'm going to show you is not related to the book activity per se. It is an extra activity that I would assign as homework. So here's the poster, and I would start in class by asking students to discuss why some people like dogs, why some people prefer cats, and why some people like both. Then, after students share their thoughts and experiences concerning dogs and cats, I'd ask them to choose one side, team dog or team cat, and do some research at home to find evidence to support their side. For example, if they choose team cat, they have to find evidence that shows that cats are better than dogs. Likewise, if they choose team dog, they have to find evidence that shows that dogs are better than cats. But there's a catch. If they are team cat, they have to search the web using the following terms. Why are dogs better than cats? If they are team dog, they have to search using the terms, why are cats better than dogs? They have to go through the results and find evidence to support their teams. The next class, you ask them about the experience. Why was it harder to find evidence to support your team when you use those search terms? Which search terms would be more impartial? Maybe difference between dogs and cats or cats and dog? And then you teach them about confirmation bias and ask them to think of other situations in which confirmation bias may be present. So in this exercise, you are taking an opportunity to introduce a type of bias and practice critical thinking skills with your students. You are asking them to listen to the reasons why people may have a different opinion. Find something that they can agree with, even if it doesn't support their views. Notice how their biases influence how they get information about something, and how this bias impacts the discussion they were having. So this is how I believe we can talk about biases with our students and increase the chances of them incorporating critical thinking skills to their lives. Shall we try another one? Okay, so let's talk about attribution bias or attributional biases. Now, this bias affects the way we determine who or what was responsible for something. We draw conclusions based on a person's character because we don't have the full picture of a situation. We don't know what's really happening. So this activity is from page 123, activity 1, and there are two, I think these are Airbnb user reviews. Okay, so one is a man from Tokyo, and the other is a woman from France. Again, this suggestion is not mentioned in the teacher's guidelines for this activity. It is just an example of the point I'm trying to make here, that you can use the book as an input, as a starting point to introduce the topic of bias to your students, okay? So let's take a look at what Akira wrote. All right, so you organize students in groups and tell them that some users on the Airbnb website disagreed with Akira and said that the apartment was not big. In fact, it was pretty small. The bedrooms were small, the balcony was small, there wasn't a yard. How can that be big? And then you ask the groups, why did Akira say that in the review? But before they start discussing, you give each group a slip of paper with one piece of information, and each group will receive a different piece of information. The pieces of information could be something like, Akira is young. Akira is a man. Akira is Japanese. Akira lied. And then you let the groups discuss and come to an answer. When they're done, you invite some volunteers to share their answers and review which piece of information they were given. You ask the groups if that information influenced their answers and how. Then you ask questions to show to students that they don't really know Akira, and they haven't been to the apartment, and they didn't have enough information to judge Akira. For example, do they know how many times Akira has used the services of Airbnb? How many countries has he been to? How many reviews did he write? How expensive was this apartment? Where was this apartment? And so on. And then you reveal the right answer, that Akira is from Tokyo, one of the most populated cities in the world, and the cost of living there is very high. So most people there live their entire lives in small apartments because that's what they can afford. He spent his whole life living in a small apartment, so when he went to another country, every apartment seemed to be bigger than the one he was used to, especially because there was a balcony with many plants. And then you teach them about attribution or attributional biases, and ask them to think of other situations in which this type of bias may be present. Okay. Do we have time for one more? Yeah. Okay, okay. This time I'll be talking about the halo effect. Now, the halo effect happens when you have a positive first impression of a person or something, and you assume there are other positive qualities. Or for example, when you buy a product and you love it, and so you assume that other products from the same company are also great. So the halo effect is coloring your perception of things. So how can we introduce it to our students? Well, let's use the opening image in Unit 6, page 63. All right. You tell students to observe the image and then introduce the firefighters. You ask students to say some qualities that a firefighter has. You can ask things like, are they courageous? Are they athletic? Are they patient? Are they friendly? Do you think they do volunteer work on Christmas? Do they give money to the poor? And so on. Then you ask them to answer the questions in the think section, in the activity there, and make sure they mention other activities these firefighters do in their free time, when they are with their families and friends, when they are on vacation, and so on. When they are done discussing, you invite volunteers to share their answers with the class. And then you ask, why didn't you assume anything bad about these people? And you wait for their explanations. Then you will tell them that Just because they are firefighters, that doesn't mean they are perfect. They have bad days. They have relationship problems. They have financial problems. They lie. They have arguments with people they love. They may have prejudice against a group of people. We don't know. And then you explain that they were influenced by the halo effect bias. And then you proceed to explain the halo effect bias and ask them to think of other situations in which this type of bias may influence our impressions of someone. Sometimes you can take the opportunity to teach the opposite of the bias. In the case of the halo effect, it's the horns effect. That is, associating negative attitudes or behaviors to people or things based on a negative first impression. So remember the example I gave to talk about the differences between bias, stereotype, and prejudice, the one with the Japanese person? That was an example of the horns effect bias. So, did you notice the pattern in these examples I gave? So here's what I did. First, I chose a bias, okay? So you go and search for a list of biases and read their basic definitions to get to know them. And then you go deeper. You learn about it, okay? After you choose the bias you want to teach your students, you read about it to understand how this bias is created or how it presents itself. Then you identify opportunities to use this bias, be it using the book, during an activity, during class activities, as homework, etc. When you understand the bias, you are more likely to think of opportunities this bias will present itself in your classes. It could be used as a warm-up activity, a complement to an activity that already exists in the book. You can add it to a discussion activity, or you can assign it as a homework. There are many ways to work with them. Next, you create conditions so that this type of bias will be present without students knowing about it. So this is very important. You have to create the conditions for biases to rear up their ugly head, so to speak, in a natural way. Even if you have to use inputs like the slips of paper, even if you have to guide students with questions or encourage the use of bias, like in the case of the firefighters. Next, you reveal the influence this bias had on students. Okay, once the activity is done, then you draw your students' attention to the effect of the bias, the effect the bias had on them, because it's very likely that they were not aware of it. Then you formally introduce the bias. That is, you name the bias. You explain the idea behind this bias. And you provide some extra examples. And finally, you transfer that knowledge to other situations. Then, to make sure your students got it, you ask them to think of other scenarios, situations in which this bias may be present. They may even give testimonials about how such bias has affected their judgment or behavior in the past. Okay? And that's how I would work with biases in my classes. Now, by now, you might be thinking, well, how do I overcome my own biases when I'm teaching? Okay, so first, identify your own biases, okay? Think about this, for example, think about the students or workmates to whom you have a difficult relationship with, those who get on your nerves. Okay? Ask yourself, what are my biases towards this person? How can I really listen to this person and understand this person's point of view? So the objective here is not to let biases blind you and prevent you from listening receptively and being open-minded. That doesn't mean you have to be friends with this person or that you have to agree with everything this person says. You're only making sure that your biases are not responsible for your judgment or behavior towards this person. At least not the only reason why you do that. Okay? Also, apply the same principle to subjects. For instance, in a discussion about eating habits, for example, what are the biases you bring into the conversation? Do you have a negative perception of vegans, for example? Are you bothered by the idea of eating healthy? And so on. Well, you have to teach not only students, but workmates and school staff about biases. Okay? Because that helps create an environment in which critical thinking is encouraged. Make a comment every time you notice some kind of bias. Talk about examples of bias that you notice in school material or school advertisement. Okay? Try to make it part of the conversation. You can also watch and learn from other teachers. You know those teachers who seem to get along well with all students, with all colleagues, who can talk about anything and have a healthy discussion, no matter the topic. So observe what they do and ask them how they do it. How do they approach and relate to students? How do they talk about hot topics? And then try to incorporate what you learned into your own practice. And finally, if you are a critical thinker, you probably will take everything I said with a grain of salt. Do your own research. Think about what I said and showed to you today. Reflect on the benefits and throwbacks of using this approach and reach your own conclusions. All I can do is hope that this webinar has given you something to think about in the following weeks, some insights, some ideas, and that you can find a way to incorporate the study of bias into your classes. Thank you for your attention. Now, Katja, are you there?
Yes, I'm coming back. Here I am. Thank
Great.
you very much, Mauricio, for this very inspiring presentation, and that made us think a lot about
that's the goal.
Yeah, I think people are still digesting all this content and reflecting on what was presented. I believe
it's an ongoing work.
Yes, exactly. And it's such an important life competence to be developed, especially with teenagers, right?
Yeah, I'd say especially with children, because I've read studies that show that children of at the age of 5, they presented signs of racial bias. By the age of 10, most of their attitudes are already settled. So, and we won't talk to them about biases at a later age, so that might be a little late. So I think we should be careful, but we should start thinking about the possibility of making these things clear to children, you know, because they understand. I think they can do it.
We need to be very aware of that. So let's check if we have questions. We do.
Let's see if I can answer them.
Yes, I believe you can. So a question from Christina. It's in the chat box. Christiane. Concerning issues like politics, How can I succeed in teaching about biases? That's a good question.
I think if I know the answer, you know, because I can't even do that with my own family, with my own immediate circle of friends. That's the $1 million question. But what I think we should be aware of is, do I give a chance to listen to what this person is doing? Can I understand where this person is coming from? You know, why does this person believe what he believes? You know, and as I said, that doesn't mean you have to agree or be friends with this person, but at least you are making sure that your own biases are not playing a part here in the way you interact with this person. Because that's the difference, you know. Having biases is natural. It's a cognitive mechanism that we use to make quick judgments. Okay, it's something that we learned. It simplifies lives, but at the same time, it creates problems. So, and that's why I think it's not natural. Okay, because we usually go for what's faster, more practical, and proved right in the past. But with critical thinking, we may be doing the wrong thing concerning biases.
Good, Maurício. We have one more question from Carolina Curcio. Hello, sir. Thanks for your lecture and time. Do you believe it's possible for someone to have a completely impartial discourse?
No. And I don't think that's even healthy, you know. Because if we didn't have our own opinions, on our own view of the world, and how could we live? We would all be the same person, right? There would be no. It would be an impediment to development, for example, you know, because sometimes we need to ponder both sides to make something richer, you know. Many times because I tend to have be aware of my own biases, and I make an effort to try to make the most of it. Now that I know that I have this bias, I try to use it to improve myself. So, and the way I do is to listen to other people's perspectives, and especially when the examples I gave in the webinar were mostly about Japanese people, because that's what I noticed. It happened to my family, friends. It happened to me. And I had students who refused to have classes with me because they had bad experiences with Japanese people in the past. So I had to talk to them and convince them to give me a chance, you know. And it usually works, because I don't think people do that because they hate you. Most of the time they do it because they fear what they don't know. They fear pain. They don't want to, you know, who wants to feel pain? Who wants to go home feeling bad? Nobody does. So biases, they kind of protect us from these things. Okay.
Exactly, I agree with you, Mauricio. Several positive comments here in the chat. And Herbert is asking, it seems to me bias is much similar to prejudice. Can you please refresh the difference between them?
I'd say biases result in prejudice, but bias is just an inclination. It's a tendency. It's not an action. The prejudice is the action. Okay, when, for example, in the case I just mentioned, that one student, and I understand why. I know she was an older lady. She used to live in the countryside, and she met some Japanese immigrants, and they were very quiet. But she never got to know them really. Okay, and I told them that years after because she became my student, and she stayed with me for 2 years more or less. And I remember talking about immigration, and I told him about my grandparents' experience, And I said that my grandparents didn't have friends because they didn't speak Portuguese. It's not because they didn't want to be friends with their neighbors. It's just that they couldn't, you know? And then this woman, she said, maybe that's what happened to me, you know? And so that's the problem. She had a bias against Japanese people. She didn't want to have a class with a Japanese teacher. But that was a bias. She was open to try. So when I talked to her, she gave me a chance. And that never developed into prejudice. There was not an action, you know, just a bias. I think that's the difference.
Thank you. Herbert has one more question. Is bias a misconceived idea I have of something? Let me just start again. Is bias a misconceived idea I have of something, and prejudice is when I spread it deliberately?
Prejudice is when you act upon this bias and you don't give any chance, you don't give a second thought about it, you know? I think everybody has gone through this. Let me give you an example. I once bought many years ago a Motorola cell phone, and it crashed after 2 months. So my bias was that Motorola products suck, and I didn't want to buy them anymore. But after 2 years, I decided to give them another chance. Okay, so I showed prejudice by refusing to buy another model, another phone from Motorola. But then I questioned it and changed it, and guess what? I have a Motorola now.
It's the one you have now, and it's working.
So yeah, but you have to be aware. That's why I said it's not natural. We don't have many times we don't stop and think, okay, why am I doing that? Why do I think that? Okay, and I think that's the real exercise here. Before we can teach critical thinking, we have to practice and question ourselves to learn more about the way we process, you know, critical thinking skills and the way our biases affect this critical thinking.
Yes, so Herbert said he got it, right? Good explanations, Maurício.
I'm glad I was able to help.
Great. I don't see any more questions. I just would like you, Mauricio, to share your screens again, because as I told you, this is the first one in a series of webinars that we will be presenting, having teenagers in mind. But of course, most of the contents can be applied to other age groups too. As I told you, Mauricio is one of the authors of our series Global Changer for Teenagers. And if you want to have a look at the course book, you can go to the website cambridge.org/globalchanger. Or if you would like to, I don't know, clarify something concerning the material, you can write to our atendimento.br@cambridge.org. I believe in the next slide, Mauricio, we have again, can you go to that slide again when we have the series of webinars? Sorry for that, so that no people problem. Can have a look at the dates again and the authors who will be presenting in the following months.
Yeah, just give me a second.
Yeah, sure.
Some things are not practical when we do webinars.
Many thanks for all your positive comments here in the chat about the topic that Mauricio decided to explore, and I found really meaningful and useful for everyone. So in September, we will have Veronica Teodorov with the theme of Learning to Learn. Next, Viviane with creative thinking, and then Paulo with visual literacy, and Denise with cross-curricular content. So please stay tuned and watch out for our communications. And I see in the chat box, Leonardo in the background has already posted the link for the feedback form. And after you fill in our feedback form, you can download your certificate of attendance. I will. Last question, Mauricio.
Right.
From Andrea Sanchez, we still have some minutes. How should we handle a student's bias when it harms or vulnerates other students?
Well, it depends on the student's age, the situation, the environment that happened, the people involved, if it was just the students or if it was the whole school or the group. It's hard to answer that, but basically, behind each bias, there is a reason. Okay, they are not born out of nowhere. So talking to the student might help get into the root of the problem, even though they are not, most of the time, they are not aware of it. I'm not aware of it most of the time. The difference is that I read about it. And then when you put that in your mind, you say, okay, this is that one, that's the Dunning-Kruger effect or something. You name it. You can even identify it by name. So I think the first thing you should do is talk, get to know, listen, to see if you can help the students find out the reason why he presents this bias. But again, a bias is a tendency. If it harms the students, that's prejudice. It's the action, right? If he only thinks about it, but he questions himself and he says, okay, maybe I'm wrong, that's a bias. The next step is the prejudice. Mm-hmm. It's when you act based on the biases and you harm people or hurt their feelings.
Good tip. Try to get to the root of the problem, right?
Yeah, Mauricio? I'm not saying you're gonna succeed because, bias. That's the interesting part. When right at the beginning, I said I have more questions than answers because cognitive scientists have more questions than answers right now. So they are still trying to understand these things and how we can, and if we can, solve all the problems that biases causes.
Exactly. All right, people, we don't have more time. I saw a question regarding if the person can sign up for the next webinars. Not yet, right? Please wait for our communications, our emails in your inboxes. We would like to thank you, Mauricio, very much for this very insightful presentation. Thanks, everyone, for all the participations, for being here with us, and hope to see you soon in our next webinar. Enjoy the weekend, relax, and thank you once again. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.